Target destroyed. With those two words from a Soviet interceptor pilot, 269 lives were erased in a shower of missile fragments over the Sea of Japan. On a moonless night in 1983, a state-of-the-art Boeing 747 deviated 650 kilometers off course, overflying one of the most sensitive military installations on Earth. The pilots thought they were on a routine path to Seoul. The Soviets thought they were hunting a U.S. spy plane. Where are you watching from? Comment below. This is the chilling story of how a single autopilot setting changed the course of history and gave the world GPS. The tragedy of August 31st, 1983 began at Anchorage, Alaska. KL-007, commanded by Captain Chun Byung-in, a veteran with 10,000 hours, was set for a routine crossing to South Korea. The route, Romeo 20, was the shortest path across the Pacific, but skirted dangerously close to Soviet-restricted airspace. The error chain began just minutes after takeoff. To save time, the controller cleared the flight to fly directly to the Bethel waypoint. Because Bethel was out of range of their radios, the pilots engaged the autopilot in heading mode at 245 degrees. The plan was simple. Fly this heading until the computers captured the programmed route, then switch to nav mode. Here is where the expert trap snapped shut. The pilots apparently forgot to flip that switch. Instead of following a zigzag path of 10 waypoints, the massive 747 stayed on a fixed compass heading, a long, straight road to nowhere. As they crossed the Pacific, the gap between where they were and where they should have been grew wider by the minute. By the time they reached the Bethel waypoint, they were already 12 miles off course. They reported passing Bethel anyway, likely assuming the small discrepancy was just standard 1980s era inaccuracy. But the inertial navigation system, INS, doesn't lie. It simply does what it's told. The pilots were in a warm cocoon of confidence, chatting with a colleague on KL Flight 15 just 10 minutes behind them. They were present aware, but geographically blind. But that decision would have been enough to destroy most people. What happened next made everything before it look minor. As KL-007 drifted hundreds of miles off course, it entered the buffer zone of the Soviet Union. On the Kamchatka Peninsula, the USSR was preparing for a secret missile test. They were on high alert for the RC-135, a U.S. spy plane that looked eerily similar to a 747 on radar. If you're finding this breakdown of Cold War tension and navigational failure vital, hit the subscribe button now. We analyze the invisible triggers of aviation disasters every week. The Soviets saw two blips on their screens. One was the actual spy plane circling safely in international waters. The other was KL-007, heading straight for their base. To the Soviet commanders, this wasn't a lost airliner. It was a brazen intruder. They scrambled 4 fighter jets, but KL-007 was moving too fast. The flight crossed the peninsula and slipped back into international waters before they could catch it. The pilots remained oblivious. They even joked about the autumn leaves they wanted to see upon arrival. They received one final warning from KAL-15, who reported completely different wind directions. KAL-007 had a headwind. KAL-15 had a tailwind. This is a massive red flag in aviation. It means you are in 2 different parts of the sky. But confirmation bias took over. The crew waved it off as just one of those things. The 747 then crossed Sakhalin Island. This time, the Soviets wouldn't miss. 2 Su-15 interceptors pulled up behind the jet. The pilot, Major Gennady Osipovich, reported seeing the plane's navigation lights. "They are on," he told his commanders. This should have been the clue that it was a civilian jet. But the expert trap was now a military one. His commanders, terrified of losing their jobs for another border violation, ignored the evidence. She thought she had won. She had no idea what Thomas was already putting in motion. The climax of Flight 007 was a tragedy of timing. Just as Osipovich was ordered to fire, the KL pilots requested a climb to 37,000 feet to save fuel. As the heavy jets slowed down to climb, the Soviet fighter zoomed past it. Osipovich interpreted this as a combat evasive maneuver. He dropped back and fired two K-8 air-to-air missiles. One missile detonated near the tail, severing 3 of the 4 hydraulic systems and destroying the elevators. The 747 didn't explode. It began a frantic, uncontrolled climb to 38,000 feet as the crew struggled to understand why the plane was shaking. They had no idea they had been hit. They donned oxygen masks and radioed Tokyo. Rapid decompression, descending to 10,000. For nearly 12 minutes, the Queen of the Skies fought to stay alive. The plane entered a slow, left-hand spiral. Fragments of the missile had punctured the skin in dozens of places, and the pressurized air was screaming out of the fuselage. The investigation, finalized by the ICAO in 1993, rejected the theory of a spy mission. It concluded that KL-007 was a victim of simple human neglect combined with a rigid Soviet military structure. The smoking gun was the autopilot switch left in heading mode. The tragedy sparked an international outcry. In response, President Ronald Reagan issued a directive that changed the world. He ordered the military's Global Positioning System, GPS, to be made available for civilian use so that no airliner would ever be lost again. The 269 souls lost that night became the reason you have a blue dot on your phone today. But what Thomas did next, nobody saw coming. Korean Airlines Flight 007 is one of the most significant and controversial incidents in aviation history. Often used as a defining case study in situational awareness, navigation error, and geopolitical tension. On September 1st, 1983, a Boeing 747 operating from New York to Seoul was shot down by Soviet interceptor aircraft after it strayed far off its intended flight path and entered restricted Soviet airspace over the Sea of Japan. All 269 passengers and crew were killed. At the core of the tragedy was a navigation error that went undetected for hours. The aircraft had drifted off course and continued flying along a parallel but incorrect route, gradually moving deeper into restricted airspace. Despite being experienced international pilots, the crew failed to recognize the deviation in time to correct it. This breakdown in situational awareness became the foundation of one of aviation's most studied failures. The expert trap, in this case, operated in multiple layers. For the KAL crew, it was the assumption that the aircraft's navigation systems and procedures were functioning correctly, reinforcing a false sense of being on course. This created what is often called the routine trap, treating a complex international flight through sensitive airspace as if it were a predictable, low-risk route. Over time, small deviations were not challenged aggressively enough, and the mental model of "we are where we think we are" replaced continuous verification. On the other side, Soviet military commanders also fell into a different form of the expert trap: belief perseverance. Radar data showed an unidentified aircraft entering restricted airspace, and they interpreted it through the lens of Cold War expectations. The assumption that a civilian airliner could not possibly stray so far off course reinforced a defensive conclusion that the target must be hostile or intentional. That belief, combined with political tension, escalated the situation to a fatal decision. The disaster permanently changed global aviation navigation practices. Today, modern aircraft rely heavily on satellite-based navigation systems, such as GPS, alongside multiple redundant inertial navigation systems. Cockpit instruments continuously cross-check position data, and warning systems alert crews when flight paths deviate from programmed routes. Modern avionics also include mode annunciators, visual indicators that clearly display which navigation mode is active, reducing the risk of silent misconfiguration. Additionally, crew training now places strong emphasis on cross-verification and big-picture awareness. Pilots are trained to actively question navigation consistency, especially on long-haul flights over remote or politically sensitive regions. The goal is to ensure that no single assumption, no matter how experienced the crew, can override real-time positional awareness. Beyond technology, KAL-007 is also a psychological lesson. It demonstrates how humans naturally prefer coherent narratives over uncertain data. Once a mental model forms, we are on course. Contradictory signals are often dismissed or rationalized. This cognitive bias, known as belief perseverance, is one of the most dangerous elements in high-stakes environments like aviation. The Cold War context has faded, but the human vulnerabilities exposed by the incident remain unchanged. Modern systems can provide constant updates, alarms, and redundancy, but they cannot eliminate the need for disciplined attention. Ultimately, KL007 is remembered not just as a navigation failure, but as a failure of continuous questioning. It teaches that expertise without verification is fragile, and that the most dangerous course is the one where everyone believes they are already correct. There's a final, chilling reason why the Soviet pilot later admitted he knew it was a passenger plane, but pulled the trigger anyway. To see the secret interview that was hidden for decades, watch this video next. It shows the true price of just following orders.